UCLA, the first African-American history course. He's been on national television, having traveled extensively, and he's been on the Today Show, Good Morning America, and PBS Meal era. He also has reshaped the face of American history, which is what some of his reviewers have said. And he's been at UC Berkeley for 32 years, just retired this January, is now writing his 11th book, and is truly an important thinker in the field of multiculturalism and ethnicity. So we're very, very, very honored to have Takaki here tonight. So you're on.
Good evening. Hey, this is more than a good evening, isn't it? Isn't this a great evening? What a great turnout. Thank you. It was a long drive up here on 101 at 4:30 in the afternoon. You know? But I understand that there's San Francisco State University who made that drive. Thank you. Let's see. Well, Dean Leader, when you introduced me, you told them stories about me. But there's something important that Dean Leader did not tell you about me. As I stand here before you, I might look like a professor or even a philosopher with my silver mane, huh? But I was born and I grew up in Hawaii, and like some of you, maybe many of you, as a teenager, I was not academically inclined, okay? In fact, I used to be a surfer, you know? Yes, a serious surfer. And when my students at Berkeley find out about Takaki's past, they get very curious. How did a surfer turn out to be a scholar? Well, what happened was this. I attended a private high school in Hawaii, an Episcopalian high school, and during my senior year, I had to take a required course in religion. And my teacher's name was Dr. Sunji Nishi, PhD. This was the first Asian American PhD I had ever met in my life up to this point. And I can remember, as students, we were very impressed. Dr. Sunji Nishi, PhD, an Asian American, a Japanese American with a PhD. And I can remember walking home, going home, and asking my mother a question. My mother, who had been born on a sugarcane plantation and who had only an 8th grade education. I said, Mom, my teacher's name is Dr. Sunji Nishi, PhD. Mom, what's a PhD? And she said, I don't know, but he must be very smart, you know. And I think a light went on in my head. Maybe someday I could become Ronald Takaki, PhD. So I began to study hard, okay? And Dr. Nishi required us to write essays every 2 weeks. And he would scribble marginal comments in these essays that I wrote for him. And so a relationship developed between Dr. Nishi through my essays and his marginal comments. And he would ask me, in his marginal comments, epistemological questions. Do you know what is meant by epistemology? You know, it's a good 50-cent word that I make sure all of my students at Berkeley know. Okay? Let me write it for you. Epistemology. Okay? Got it? Right there. Epistemology. What's the definition of epistemology? What is epistemology? Well, hey, right there, yes. How do we come to know what we know? Hey, that's pretty good. Yeah, the working definition that I teach my students is, how do you know what you know? Okay? So it's a two you knows. How do you know what you know? In other words, epistemology is a critical thinking skill. It's a theory of knowledge. And so Dr. Nishi would say, how do you know what you know about this subject? And I would think, gee, I really don't know very much about this subject. I have to rethink my ideas and my generalization. Well, during the second semester of my senior year, as I was walking across campus, Dr. Nishi flagged me, said, Ronald, wait a minute, I have a question for you. This was late in the second semester of my senior year. This was around April. He said, Ronald, I think it would be good for you to go away to college. Good for your personal growth and for your intellectual development. There's this fine liberal arts college in Ohio called the College of Wooster. Would you like to go to the College of Wooster in Ohio? And I blurted out, no, Ohio, wow, that seems so far away. And it was far away. At that time you had these propeller planes, right? No 747s. So I said no. And he said, well, would it be okay if I wrote to the college and told them about you? And I said, okay. And I walked away and I forgot completely about this conversation. A month later, I received a letter from the Dean of the College of Wooster. And the letter read, Dear Mr. Takaki, you have been accepted to the College of Wooster, but please fill out the application form. This dean hadn't received my transcripts yet. He didn't know what my GPA was. And that's the problem with GPA, isn't it? Huh? It's grade point average, okay? So my GPA wasn't that good. But here I was during my senior year. I was getting good grades during my senior year. But my GPA was lower than the grades I had been receiving during my senior year. And that's the problem with universities today, evaluating applications based upon GPA. GPA doesn't give an accurate snapshot of the student at the time of applying for admission. And this dean hadn't received my SAT scores yet, and my SAT scores were pretty mediocre. But one thing we do know for certain about SAT scores, right? They correlate with family incomes. They rise together, For years, I've been advocating the elimination of the SAT. And guess what happened? 4 years ago, the president of the University of California, Dick Atkinson, thought, hey, that's a good idea. Let's get rid of the SAT. So what happened? I went to Wooster. And at Wooster, Ohio, small town Ohio, I experienced a culture shock. Right after I arrived, my fellow students, and it was a pretty homogeneous campus, okay, would ask me questions like, how long have you been in this country? Where did you learn to speak English, okay? Now, college students today tell me they still get asked those questions if they're Asian American. But I could see that my fellow students didn't see me as a fellow American. I didn't look like an American to them, and I didn't have an American-sounding name. And so at Wooster, I felt homesick. I felt very lonely. I felt I did not belong to the Wooster community of students. When I look back at my Wooster experience, I realized that it was not their fault that they could not and did not see me as an American. Think about it. What had they learned in courses called U.S. History about Asian Americans? or Chicanos, or the native peoples of this country, or African Americans. There is what I call a master narrative of American history. And everyone in this room knows about the master narrative of American history. It's the pervasive, powerful, but mistaken story that this country was settled by European immigrants, and that Americans are white or European in ancestry. But we can just look at ourselves in this room and know that we came originally from many different shores, not just Europe. Well, I graduated from Wooster in 1961, and then I went to Berkeley to study for the PhD in American history. And Berkeley and the 60s changed my life. I wouldn't be here tonight if it had not been for Berkeley and the 60s. Like thousands of Berkeley students, I was inspired by the moral vision of Martin Luther King. And I can remember 1964, Mississippi Freedom Summer. And I can remember how horrified I was by the murder of 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi. That was 1964. And at that time, I was looking around for a dissertation topic. And so I decided to study slavery, to do a study of slavery for my dissertation. 1965, Watts exploded. And some of us in this room might still remember watching that Watts rebellion on television, black and white TV, seeing the black smoke rising to the skies above Los Angeles, and seeing what looked like a bombed-out city after the Watts riot. UCLA in 1966 decided to create a new position in the history department and to offer UCLA's first black history course. That was 1966. I was finishing my dissertation on slavery. I applied for the position, and guess what happened? Well, your dean has already told you. I was offered this position. But you're probably wondering, Professor Takaki, what was it like for you to teach UCLA's first black history course, huh? Well, at that time, I was only 28 years old. I had black hair. I had a crew cut. So there I was at UCLA. And when I walked into the classroom, I discovered that it was held in a huge auditorium with 500 seats. And every seat was taken, and students were sitting in aisles. And there was a loud chitter-chatter. Students were excited, UCLA's first black history course. Well, there was a stage in the front of the auditorium, and as I made my way to the front of the auditorium, all of a sudden a silence descended in this room, and their eyes were riveted on me, and I could just feel them saying to themselves, "Funny, he doesn't look black." Yeah. So here I was, really nervous. My first course, my first lecture at UCLA. And I got to the stage and I got behind the podium. But before I could say anything, this tall black student, and these were the days of black militancy, when black students wore dashikis and sported afros. This tall black student stands up in the middle of the room and he raises his hand and he says, "Well, Professor Takaki, what revolutionary tools are we going to learn in this class?" And I thought to myself, this is not the way I would like to begin my career as a teacher. And you're probably wondering, how did I answer his question? Well, I think this is what I said. I said, we're going to study the history of the United States as it relates to black people. We're going to strengthen our critical thinking skills and also our writing skills. And these can be revolutionary tools if you want to make them so. But as I taught this course, I looked out at the faces of my students, and I saw students whose roots went back to Europe, students whose roots went back to Africa, but I also saw students whose roots went back to Mexico, and students whose roots went back to Asia. And the diversity of my students led me to ask myself the epistemological question: how do I know what I know about the history of the peoples of the United States of America as reflected in the very diversity of my students? And this led me then to teach a new course, Racial Inequality in America, a Comparative Historical Perspective. And the key here was comparative, okay? Where I would study the experiences of different groups, African Americans, Chicanos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and also European immigrant groups, okay? I left UCLA and came to Berkeley in 1972, and I brought that comparative multicultural approach with me. And this comparative multicultural approach led to the writing of an abundance of books, okay? Now, some of you are asking, well, what is this comparative multicultural approach? Well, let me tell you first what it is not, okay? And let me write this down for you. It's not the add-on approach. The add-on approach keeps intact the master narrative, and it adds on, say, a day on African Americans, and then a day on Asian Americans. This add-on approach marginalizes the study of minorities in the United States. My approach is not the group-specific approach, okay? One group like, say, Chicanos or Native Americans. My approach seeks to look at the different pieces of ethnicity and race as part of the mosaic called the United States. But you're wondering, Professor Takaki, we like your comparative approach, your multicultural approach. But what does this approach look like concretely? Okay? Well, what I'd like to do tonight is to present a lecture within a lecture. Okay? I'd like to be a history teacher. We have a history teacher here. And I promised him that I would give a history presentation. I'd like to give a 15-minute history lecture within a lecture, focusing on the 19th century, the crucible for the making of modern multicultural America. I'd like this 15-minute lecture also to be interactive. I'd like to be able to ask you questions and get some answers from you, okay? History is usually his story, right? Yeah, I can just see it on your faces. What about her story for a change? So I'd like to examine the 19th century and its diversity from the perspective of the women. Okay. And I'd like to look at two migrations, one across the Atlantic and another Pacific. Okay, so let's begin this 15 minute lecture within a lecture. What group crossed the Atlantic in large numbers in the 19th century? Yeah. The Irish, okay. Let me write this down, okay. How many Irish came here? Hey, it's not your fault, you know. 500,000? Okay, you're guessing, huh? Yeah. Okay. Somebody want a second guess? Okay. Got to read my book, okay? Yeah. 4 million Irish came over here. Don't worry, I didn't know this until I did research, okay? 4 million Irish came over here. What group crossed the Pacific in the 19th century? Some of us are in this room because of this migration. The Pacific. Huh? What? Chinese, okay. Yeah. The Japanese came in the early 20th century, anyway. Okay, so the Chinese. How many Chinese came over here? Hey, this is California history. We should know this. Yeah. 8 or 9 million? Wow, that's way off. Sorry about that. Whoa. Okay, about 500,000. Okay. Okay, so from the perspective of her story, what percentage of the Irish immigrants were women? What percentage? What did you say? Close to half. That's pretty good. It was 52%. A high percentage were women. What percentage of the Chinese immigrants were women? Almost none. 9%? Almost none. 9%. What do we split it, okay? 5%. 5%. Okay, so this allows us then to frame an analytical question. Why is it that proportionately so many of the Irish immigrants were women, and why is it that proportionately so few of the Chinese immigrants were women? Okay, so we begin with the Irish. The Irish came over here because of the what? Okay, if you said potato famine, you're largely wrong, okay? But it's not your fault, you know? Yeah, because that's what we learn every St. Patrick's Day. But that's what the media tells us, you know? Yeah, and also our teachers, okay? The potato famine lasted from 1844 to 1854. During this time, 1 million Irish came over here. Is that clear? Clear enough? Let's try this. Is that better? Here, that's better, huh? Better for me. Okay, so 1 million Irish came the potato famine, but we said 4 million Irish came over here. 1 million Irish came before the potato famine, and 2 more million Irish came after the potato famine. So it couldn't have been just the potato famine, you see. To blame a blight is the master narrative of British history. Don't blame British imperialism. Famine. What happened was this. British colonial policymakers in London in the early 19th century came up with a policy. They wanted to make a supply of beef to England. So they sent out instructions to Protestant landlords in Ireland. And these landlords owned 90% of the island, okay? British imperialism had been underway for centuries in Ireland. And so the Irish Catholic people had been dispossessed of their lands. So they were renting and leasing lands from Protestant landowners. And now they were being instructed by British colonial policy makers in London to transform agriculture in Ireland from potato agriculture or tillage agriculture to ranching agriculture. And this led to the evictions of tens of thousands of Irish peasant farming families. This economic transformation had gender significance. The Irish men were hired as wage earners on these ranches, but the women had been rendered economically superfluous. I'm putting these words down because I'm hoping that there'll be explosions in your own mind and about what's happening today, with certain populations being rendered economically superfluous, okay? But this economic transformation had gender significance. And so it created conditions of push for women from Ireland. So they crossed the Atlantic and they came here. What did they do here? Over 50% of them found jobs as maids, and that's why you have the stereotype of the Irish maid. But this is what I learned also. About a third of them became factory workers. They worked in the textile mills of Lowell, Boston, Providence, Pawtucket, okay? So I'm going to draw a map here. And I'd like you to use your imagination and also be generous, okay? Sometimes this map works, sometimes it doesn't. But I'm doing it spontaneously, okay? So let's see how it goes tonight. Oh, I'm not sure about tonight. Okay, how's that for the United States? So where are we? Let's see, Kotati, around there somewhere. No. Maybe there. Okay, so here you have these Irish women. This pen isn't that good. Let me see if I can find another pen. Working in the textile mills of Lowell, Boston, Providence, Pawtucket. Now, when I said textile, what came to your mind? What raw material were they processing? Cotton. Where did this cotton come from? In the South. The Industrial Revolution, at the center of the Industrial Revolution was cotton production, textile production. I'm in trouble with that. Okay. Well, let me use this pen. So there's a tremendous demand for cotton production. And this led to the expansion of cotton agriculture into upcountry South Carolina and Georgia, into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, okay? These were lands that had been inhabited by Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws. So entire tribes were removed to Oklahoma in the early 19th century. And these lands then became agriculture for cotton production. Cotton that was planted and harvested by enslaved African Americans. Okay. I said that cotton agriculture advanced into Texas. Texas at that time was part of what? Part of Mexico, okay? So you have these slaveholders crossing the border into Mexico, into Texas, bringing with them cotton seeds and their enslaved African Americans. Mexico in 1830 declared that it would be illegal for Americans to enter Mexico. What did Americans do? They continued to cross that border. They were illegal aliens, when you think about it. Mexico in 1830 also declared that slavery would be prohibited in Mexico, Mexican territory. So what happened? Remember the Alamo, okay, 1836. That led to the secession of Texas from Mexico and the annexation of Texas then in 1846. Then there was this war between the United States and Mexico that led to the annexation of half of Mexico, including California. There was a hidden reason why the U.S. and business interests wanted a war against Mexico. And what was that hidden reason? They wanted a bay, the Bay of San Francisco, in order to develop trade with Asia. Okay. This brings us then to the second question. Why is it that so few of the Chinese immigrants were women? Okay, the Chinese first came here for the gold rush, but then they came here to help build the transcontinental railroad that would connect San Francisco with the East Coast. The Central Pacific Railroad had a workforce that was 90% Chinese. The Union Pacific Railroad had a workforce that was almost entirely Irish. Okay, so one of the great achievements of industrialization, the Transcontinental Railroad, was an achievement of immigrant workers. So why is it that so few of these Chinese immigrants were workers? Well, there were many reasons, but I'd like to highlight one of them. These employers of Chinese laborers, especially in this case the Central Pacific Railroad, wanted these Chinese men to come over and work temporarily and then return to China. Okay, they were like braceros, you know. Yeah. Charles Crocker, superintendent of the Central Pacific Railroad, said this in testimony before Congress. He said, "We want these men to come over here, work for 3 to 5 years, and then go back to China." He said, "We don't want them settling in the United States with families and becoming," and he used this term, thick in the United States. So here you have, in business policy and government policy, this master narrative of American history, that this should be a white America. And that was one of the reasons why so few of these Chinese immigrants were women. Now, when you look at what we've had, 15-minute lecture within a lecture, you realize the Irish and Chinese stories were different, but they were connected to one another. And they were connected to what happened to Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, to African Americans, and also to Mexicans. Okay. But when I think about the creation of this diversity, I can't just think about it in terms of statistics and charts and a map. I also have to remember that these were men and women with minds and wills and also voices. Always important to remember their voices. So I'd like to end my lecture tonight by sharing with you some of their voices. I told you about the Irish immigrant workers in the textile mills. As they worked, they sang songs, work songs. And historians have been gathering these work songs. And I'd like to share one of them with you tonight. I'm not going to sing. But I'd like you to listen between the lines, okay? Listen between the lines. Because these women are giving you an eye-level view of what it must have been like to have worked in those dusty and dark and noisy mills. The song goes this way. When I set out for Lowell, some factory for to find, I left my native country and all my friends behind. But now I am in Lowell and summoned by the bell. I think less of the factory than of my native dell. Now notice what is happening here. Time is no longer measured by the movement of the sun as it had been on the farms of Ireland. Time is now measured by a clock. And not just the clock, but the factory bell. Okay? And some of you in this room may be hearing Michel Foucault whispering in your ears, discipline and punish, discipline and punish. Here you have an immigrant workforce now becoming conditioned to the clock and the factory bell. And the third stanza goes, the factory bell begins to ring and we must all obey. And to our old employment go or else be turned away. If you don't pay attention to that factory bell, you'll be fired. Okay? But these women also possessed a spirit of resistance because that last stanza goes, come all you weary factory girls, I'll have you understand. I'm going to leave the factory and return to my native land. Well, very few of them returned to Ireland. They stayed and they made America a more diverse society in terms of our religion. Now, what about the Chinese women, the 5%? I had trouble finding their voices. But while I was doing research, I came across a slender stack of copies of Western Union telegrams. And these were telegrams in English sent in the 1870s in California from the foothills of the Sierras to San Francisco. And I'm wondering, you know, here we have a population of about 100,000 Chinese, and 95% of them were men. What did these men say to each other in their telegrams? And these were telegrams in English, so you can imagine a Chinese immigrant going into a Western Union office. The message would be translated and would be sent sizzling over the wire, okay, like our email today. You know. So, what did these Chinese men say to each other in their telegrams? They said different things. I can remember coming across one telegram that had just one line only. And it went something like, send the opium up quick. Okay? Yeah. And, you know, I tell my Berkeley students, oh, you know, let's analyze that document, huh? And we try and say, well, what did it mean, send the opium up quick? And some students raised their hands quickly and they said, well, you know, they're up in the Sierras and life must have been lonely up there and work must have been punishing, so they needed opium to help them relax, okay? But then other students would say, asking themselves the epistemological question, you know, well, how do you know what you know about opium? Why opium? Why not alcohol? Okay? And then, you know, some of them think, yes, opium. The British Opium Wars, the Treaty of Nanking, 1842. So here you have these British colonial policymakers making policies for Ireland, also making policies for China. And England at that time had a trade imbalance with China. It was importing porcelain, silk, tea from China, but it didn't have anything to export to China. So these British colonial policymakers came up with this idea. They said, why don't we take opium from England and ship it to China and make a profit? And the Chinese government said, no, you may not ship opium to China, and that provoked the British Opium Wars, okay, and the British annexation of Hong Kong. So these were Chinese who were coming over here, who in many cases were already addicted to opium before they landed on these shores of California. While going through these telegrams, and I'm doing this chronologically, I came across a number of references to this man named Fuchs Sing. And this is what I found out, that Fuchs Sing was living in Downeyville, California. You know where Downeyville is, right? You know, San Francisco, Sacramento, Marysville, Downeyville. Okay, Downeyville is in the foothills of the Sierras. Fuchs Sing was living in Downeyville, and he had found out about this Chinese immigrant woman, one of the 5%, living in Wadsworth, Nevada, the other side of the state line. So Fuchs Sing gets all excited. He has a friend living in Wadsworth, Nevada. He's going to telegraph his friend in Wadsworth, Nevada. And I end my lecture by just showing you this exchange of telegrams. First, dated July 5th, 1874. Sends a telegraph to Kang in Wadsworth, Nevada. The telegram reads, "Don't you let her go." Her name, by the way, is Min Q. "Don't you let her go. I will come tomorrow and see her. I want to bring her to Downeyville to live with me. What time does the train start? Answer, quick." This guy's anxious, you know. But you'd be anxious too, right, if you were one of the 95%. Huh? Yeah. What time does the train start? Answer, quick. The next day sends another message to Chung in Wadsworth, Nevada. "I will start for Wadsworth today and meet her. Tell her to wait for me to come." But there was another man. So he says, "And if she wants to go with the other man, I will let her. Don't care." But he does care. He says, "Answer." But this Min Q went off, or she was taken away by this other man. So I thought this is the end of this story. But then it came across a telegram dated August 12th, sent by Tom to Tin Yue of Downeyville. And the telegram reads, "Fuchs Sing's woman has gone to Marysville." So Min Q is in California. She's in Marysville, which is about 70 miles west of Downeyville. So Fuchs Sing gets all excited again. He has a friend living in Marysville named Sing Lung. This is what he telegraphs to Sing Lung. "Bring woman up right away. We'll pay $300. Answer, is the man who took woman there? Answer." You see, he has to find out about the other guy. Huh? At 11:05 the same day, Sing Lung wires Tai Yuen in Downeyville. "Tell Fuchs Sing, Min Q is here. What you going to do? Answer, quick." Well, Fuchs Sing had found the woman, but the question is, will Min Q agree to leave this man and to be with Fuchs Sing? Well, at 4:20 p.m. that same day, Sing Lung telegraphs Fuchs Sing. "She wants you to come right away and get warrant with officer. Friends will help. You don't be afraid. We will get her sure." So Fuchs Sing rushes down to Marysville, and on August 15th, he wires Tai Yuen. "I saw the woman." Tai Yuen is still back in Downeyville. "I saw the woman, but have not yet taken her. Send marriage certificate." And immediately Tai Yuen responds, "We'll send the certificate next stage." Well, sorry to disappoint many of you, but the telegrams end there. We don't know what happened, okay? But I'm just a historian. Huh? But if you were listening between the lines, you would have heard the silence of Min Q. Okay, these are men. You know, but still, you would have heard Min Q breaking that silence because the man had to consult with her. You know, she wanted to exercise a freedom that she probably would not have had in China, where her parents would have arranged her marriage. She was going to choose her partner in life. If you're listening between the lines, you would have been asking also, well, who was Fuxing? We don't know who he was. This is all the evidence we have, okay? But think about the dates. 1874. When was the Transcontinental Railroad completed? Anybody here know? When was the Transcontinental Railroad completed? 1869. It's 5 years later. Fuxing could have been one of the workers for the Central Pacific Railroad, but he didn't go back to China. He was sticking around, okay? So you can just imagine Fuxing saying, maybe I don't want to go back to China. Maybe I want to stay here. Maybe I want to make America my home. Maybe I'd like to become Chinese American. So he was sending a message to the future Patrick Buchanans, you know. He said, wait a minute. This is my country too. This is now our country. I helped to build this economy. I'm staying, okay? In the footsteps of Fuxing would come others, like my grandfather from Japan. Others would come from the Philippines, from Korea, from India. Others would come from Italy, Hungary, Poland, and Russia. Others would come from Mexico. Others would be forced to come here from Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Others would come here from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran. And if you listen, you can just hear them, you know, saying, maybe, 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 like Fuxing. You know. And this is where I'd like to end tonight. I'd like to end by thanking you because you've been great listeners tonight and interactive, even though you gave me wrong answers. But that's okay, you know, it's not your fault, huh? So thank you for listening to the song of the Irish immigrant women. Thank you for listening to the silence of Min Kyu. Thank you for listening to the maybes of Fuxing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes. We have some time for questions and answers. So, who'd like to begin? You know, I'd like to ask a question. Yeah, go ahead. No? No?
Can you talk about the role of things like the Chinese Exclusionary Act on immigration?
Okay, the Chinese labor was needed, okay, in California agriculture, also to build that railroad. And you might not know this, but in 1870, the Chinese represented 40% of the industrial workforce in San Francisco. And San Francisco was already the 9th leading manufacturing city in the nation. But the Chinese then were pushed out of this employment in the cities especially by white workers. But also, there was this thinking that this society should be a white society. And they did not want these Chinese men like Fuxing, who had decided to settle here, to bring wives over. This surprised me when I did my research. Over 50% of the Chinese men who came over here were already married, okay? So when they decided to stay here, they were sending home for their wives. And in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited the entry of Chinese laborers. It said laborers, okay? Yeah. Okay, but what about the women? why couldn't women come through that loophole? Because the Exclusion Act said Chinese laborers may not enter the United States. Well, there was a test case where a Chinese immigrant tried to bring his wife over, and the courts decided that she could not come in under the Chinese Exclusion Act, which specified laborers. They said that a woman takes on the identity of her husband, and if her husband is a laborer, she is a laborer, and hence she cannot come in. So that's what happened with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Yeah. Japanese workers came in to replace, to fill this need for agricultural labor in California. And then in 1907, there was this gentleman's agreement that prohibited the entry of laborers from Japan. So Japan could not issue passports to Japanese laborers. But the difference was this. With the Chinese Exclusion Act, the U.S. government decided who would be a laborer, okay? Japan, which had military muscle at this point, okay? Japan had militarized and industrialized. Japan said, okay, we'll agree to this gentleman's agreement, but we reserve the right to define who a laborer is. And they decided that women and children were not laborers. And so they issued passports to them. And they were able to come in. And this is where you have the picture bride system, where Japanese immigrant men brought in wives through the picture bride system. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What role, if any, would the San Francisco Bay Area, St. Paul, and New York play in Chinese community?
You're talking about the 6 companies?
Yeah, like the Chinese Association.
These merchants associations were defensive, you know, a way to protect themselves. They initiated some lawsuits. They hired actually white lawyers to help them. Mm-hmm. And they helped to create a community, you know, within Chinatown. Okay. Let's see.
Your book, Different Mirror, in the introduction, you talk about running taxi cabs
Yeah.
and the taxis are asking the question, that whole thing, the discussion happening with taxis that you read in the mirror. Is that what you can learn from that film and use it out there, or do you use that as a device to show me?
You've read my book, A Different Mirror. Yeah. It opens with this story about how I had flown to Virginia, and I got in a taxi to be driven to Virginia Beach. Yeah, I flew into Norfolk, okay, Norfolk. And this taxi driver asked me, you know, how long had I been in this country, okay? Now, this is not a Southern thing, you know? Don't think that only Southerners, white Southerners ask me that question. And it's not working class, because PhDs have asked me that question too, you see. We were looking at each other through his rear view mirror. And you know, when he asked me how long you have been in this country, I blurted out, all my life, you know, kind of like irritated. There was a tone of irritation in my voice. And then I thought, hey, Ron, you know, like, cool down, you know. It's not his fault, you know. What do you mean? What had he learned, say, about Asian Americans, you know, in U.S. history courses? So, I used that story about the mirror, but I already had in my mind, you know, this book entitled A Different Mirror, you see, yeah. But that story worked well in terms of the metaphor for the book, yeah. But notice what I did with that story. You know, I went on then to describe what was going on in my mind as we were being driven to Virginia Beach. And I thought, you know, here up the way was Jamestown, where the first Africans were landed in 1619 by a Dutch slave ship. But also, I was thinking, hey, these were lands that had belonged to the Powhatans, you know, before the arrival of the English. Also, this was the time of the first Gulf War. You know, I saw all these yellow ribbons everywhere. And this is Norfolk, you know, a military city. But I then began to think about the Bermuda, you know, and that's where I then thought about the Tempest, Shakespeare's play, performed in London in 1619, 7 years after the founding of Jamestown. And so I introduced readers to Prospero and Caliban. And then, as you noticed, that the play is the thing in the book, you know, because the Tempest becomes the metaphor of, oh, brave new world that has such people in it. So I'm looking at such people. Yeah. Oh, but thanks for your question.
Could you comment on the issue of reparations in the context of your master narrative?
Reparations. Well, you know, we can talk about reparations for Japanese Americans who were interned, and they won their struggle for reparations, redress and reparations. And what they had to do is challenge the master narrative of World War II. You know, we've, not all, but maybe most of us have seen the movie Saving Private Ryan. Did you see any African American soldiers in that movie? No. You know, it's like World War II. The greatest generation was a white generation fighting against fascism, But black troops were there on the beaches of Normandy. But what were they doing? They were fighting in a Jim Crow army. You know, they were unloading the cargoes. They were feeding the white combat troops, okay? But they were there too. So with the Japanese American soldiers, you know, they had to remind this country, this government, that they had been interned, okay? 120,000 of them, 2/3 of them citizens by birth. And they demanded then an apology and reparations, okay? And they were successful. You're talking about reparations for slavery, okay? Yeah, that's still a debt that needs to be paid, you know? It would be different than reparations for Japanese Americans because the government is paying only those Japanese Americans who are still alive and who had been interned, you see. So how would one make a case for reparations for African Americans? How would you make it? And I'll tell you how I would make it.
I would make it on the basis of the work that you did historically there in Virginia. I think in the 16th century.
Yeah, the hidden origins of slavery, Yes, yes. Yeah, the hidden origin. I hope all of you get a chance to read the hidden origins of slavery because just 2 days ago, you know, Ward Connolly was in the San Francisco Chronicle about the one-drop rule. Why is it that only in the United States you have the one-drop rule? You know, it doesn't matter how mixed you are, you're still black, okay? You know, even though you might be 3/4 European. You have 1/4 African, you're still black. Well, it happened in 17th century Virginia, okay? The hidden origins of slavery, Bacon's Rebellion, okay? And what surprised me was how Bacon's Rebellion was an interracial rebellion. You know, it was white indentured servants and African indentured servants. So that would be one case, one reason to make the case for reparations, in that it was the beginning of an exploitative system of labor in the colonies that made the colonies profitable. Tobacco, okay? I would also make it on the basis of what I presented tonight. You know, this industrial economy would not happen without enslaved African American labor, okay? Cotton. So when you follow the cotton, you realize that, oh, African American labor was essential for the making of an industrial America. Yeah. And we're all beneficiaries of it. Okay? Oh, wait a minute, not all of us, okay? Yeah. And also, think about superfluous populations, huh? You know, I think those groups that have been trapped in the inner cities have become superfluous to this economy. Maybe time for just one more question. Yeah.
What do you think about the idea of affirmative action and the idea, what is the argument that you give to those people that say, you know, people of color or people that have from it look at affirmative action?
Okay, well, you know, it's a moot point now in California because of Prop 209. Huh? But you know, I've debated Ward Carnally. You know, I fought that proposition. You know, I think many of us got hoodwinked, huh? Because look what they called it, the California Civil Rights Initiative. You know, who financed this initiative? Who paid people to go out and gather signatures? Huh? You know, it came from out of state. And it was headed by Ward Carnally. But the case for affirmative action is that it's not a level playing field. Okay, you know, I told you about the SATs. So, you know, like they correlate with family incomes. They rise together. I told you about GPA. I don't know how many of you know this, but after Prop 209 was passed, UC Berkeley rejected 800 black and Latino students who had 4.0 GPA. Perfect GPA. And I can remember Chancellor Berdahl at a press conference presented this fact. And, you know, reporters were stunned. How can you reject 800 Latino and black students with 4.0 GPA? He said they were not competitive. Why were they not competitive? Because their SAT scores were not as high. But still, there were 1,200, 1,300, you know. They just weren't in the 1,400 and above level, okay? But there was something else. Their GPAs were not competitive. And I thought to myself, how can you not be competitive if you have a 4.0 GPA? Well, as it turns out, there were white and Asian students who had 4.2, 4.3, 4.5 GPA. How the hell does one get a 4.2 GPA? You take an advanced placement course and you get 5 points for an AP course. Where are the advanced placement courses located? They're located mainly in the suburban wealthy school districts, okay? So the playing field is not a level playing field. And that's why we needed affirmative action. So now that Prop 209 is the law, what do? Well, I think that there are some solutions here. One, let's get rid of the SAT. I'm serious about that. Let's get rid of the SAT. Okay? Because if you come from wealthy families, you can take that SAT at the 7th grade level called the PSAT. By the time you get up there, you're pretty good. You know, Plus that you can take these Kaplan courses that guarantee that you're going to increase your SAT scores, okay? But these SAT prep courses are expensive. They charge like $1 a minute, okay? Like how many of us can afford $1 a minute for SAT prep? You know? But the other thing I would recommend is that let's get rid of that awarding a bonus point for AP courses, okay? And then third, gee, can I give you a third recommendation too? Let's get rid of No Child Left Behind. Let's get rid of these standardized tests that punishes the inner city schools because these are students who are not doing well on the standardized tests, and so their teachers and their schools get punished financially by the federal government. Okay? How's that? Okay? Oh, thank you.